Is history helping us learn from the past, remember great moments, and gain a deeper understanding of the world we live in? Or is it passing down inherited biases, fueling us with rage to seek revenge for historical grievances, and suffocating ourselves and the societies we live in? Today, we are going to be looking at Nietzsche's warning about focusing too much on history that he writes in Untimely Meditations, specifically the essay on the use and abuse of history for life. And this video will be broken up into 3 parts, with part 1 being why history erodes societies through paranoia and division, part 2 being how history cripples us on a personal level, and part 3 being why history kills creativity and leads to more commentators and less creators. And just before we start part 1, I do want to clear up that this isn't my opinion. I am merely just going over Nietzsche's perspective on this, but I do think it is an interesting one. But with that said, let's get into part 1, which is how history erodes societies through paranoia and division. For Nietzsche, the first danger of too much history is emotional. He believed that societies begin to rot when people become overly focused on remembering wounds, remembering injustices, remembering who wronged who, and remembering every detail of the past. As he writes, there is a degree of sleeplessness in remembering that is harmful to the living thing. And what he's saying there is to think about what sleeplessness does to you. When you haven't slept, you're irritable, you're emotional, you're irrational. Small things set you off. Your mind becomes cloudy, but your emotions become loud. Nietzsche says that too much historical remembering does the exact same thing. It makes people emotionally unstable, it makes them reactive, it makes them suspicious, it makes them view the world through a haze of past experiences rather than the present reality that they live in. And he gives us an example of how this manifests through a short parable, where he writes, "Imagine a generation that devotes itself to history with insatiable greed, gathering up every age and every custom, comparing all, assimilating all. Soon, it no longer believes in its own instincts. It begins to feel that it is late, a mere epigon. Out of this weakness, people separate into castes. One clings to the past with antiquarian loyalty, another demands the violent destruction of all that has been. Another seeks refuge in the cool irony of the historical man, who no longer dares to affirm anything. Thus, there arises a divided, shattered culture. One portion worships the ashes of their ancestors, another burns with the desire to reduce the world to ashes. Between them stands the weary historian who thinks himself just but in truth has drained life of its force." And what Nietzsche is showing us there in that parable is that through studying history to such an extent, we end up taking one generation that was once united, together, thought similar, could get along, and all of a sudden they became fragmented because they viewed history in a different way, which ended up changing the way they viewed the present world they lived in. Except nothing in the present world changed from yesterday. All that changed was that they uncovered more of history, and that warped the way they viewed the present world. And Nietzsche thinks that this is incredibly dangerous because it can corrupt relationships that were perfectly healthy. It can turn peaceful neighbors into adversaries simply because of some historical detail that was never relevant to the lived relationship between the two. And then when that dynamic scales up to hundreds, thousands, or millions of people, you get an entire society defined by paranoia and division. People start caring more about historical identity than about the living person they see in front of them. This is why Nietzsche believed that so many emotionally charged movements rely heavily on history, not just sharing history, but retelling it, emphasizing it, amplifying it, often in exaggerated or selective ways. Because when you pull people into an emotional interpretation of the past, you can change how they see the present. You can change what they fear. You can change who they blame. You can turn a stable society into a volatile one simply by overfeeding it with history. But then Nietzsche takes this point even further by saying that too much historical consciousness doesn't just divide people, it weakens them. As he says, excess of history makes the human being timid and unsure. When a culture becomes too aware of its past mistakes, past crimes, past failures, it stops acting boldly. Instead of looking forward and building a new future, it becomes apologetic. Everything becomes about fixing, correcting, atoning for previous sins. But Nietzsche says something subtle but important here, which is that if all your energy goes into correcting the past, you have no energy left to create something new. And Nietzsche says that you can see this play out in society, where people who genuinely want to make progress can't imagine doing anything through new ideas or new visions, as they just assume that all progress must come from repairing historical wounds, and so the future becomes nothing more than a re-edited version of the past. And Nietzsche would say that this suffocates a culture's creative spirit, as instead of inventing new ways of living, people only think in terms of revisions. Let's fix the old system, let's adjust what already exists, but nobody asks, what if we created something entirely new? And to Nietzsche, that very question becomes unthinkable when a society is completely obsessed with history. And this leads into Nietzsche's next warning, which is the idea that societies can become quote-unquote museum cultures. As he writes, a culture that has become historical is in danger of no longer being a culture at all. What he means is that when a culture becomes too focused on the past, it stops being alive, it stops evolving, it becomes a museum of itself, a place where old things are preserved, admired, and worshipped, but nothing new is created. People start telling themselves that the past had more depth, more meaning, more greatness, and so they begin trying to recreate it. They dress like the past, think like the past, imitate the past, and quote the past. But because the past is gone, the imitation feels thin. It feels more like a costume than its own culture. And an example of that would be someone today dressing like someone from the 1920s, because maybe that person views the 20s as being very historically deep and intellectual and full of life, except when they dress like someone from the 1920s in the 2020s, it looks more like an imitation, it looks thin, but they don't embody the same depth of the 1920s because they're refusing to live in their current moment. All they do is look like a caricature or someone who's more obsessed with style over real substance. As Nietzsche believed that a culture's richness doesn't come from preserving, it comes from creating. He would say that all the times throughout history that you look back on, like the Renaissance or the 20s or the medieval period, that you view as being very culturally deep, it was a time of great creation. It was a time of revolutions. It was a time where they were creating new ways of living, new styles of art, new ways of dressing, new ways of carrying themselves. It wasn't a time where they were looking back themselves, it was a time where they were looking forward. And so Nietzsche says that once a society becomes more focused on protecting old ways rather than generating new ones, it begins to die a spiritual death, even if it still functions materially. Which leads us to part 2, which is how history cripples us on a personal level. Nietzsche doesn't stop at the societal level. He believed that history doesn't only poison groups, it poisons individuals as well. As he writes, historical knowledge streams into him from limitless sources until it no longer flows, but strangles him. Imagine you're standing under a waterfall, and at first the water is refreshing, but eventually the pressure becomes overwhelming, it becomes painful, and then eventually it becomes downright dangerous. Nietzsche thinks that this is what happens to individuals who take in too much history. At first it feels educational, it feels enlightening, but eventually it becomes suffocating. You begin to feel weighed down by everything that has come before you, every achievement, every failure, every tragedy, every philosophy, and every cultural expectation of the past. And slowly, without even realizing it, you start to feel depressed or pointless. You think, what does it matter what I create? Why bother trying when so many great people already did it much better? And why trust my instincts when history shows how often instincts lead to disaster? This leads into one of Nietzsche's most important personal insights, which is that too much history makes us stop trusting our own gut. When you constantly look back, you begin to assume that the past set all the standards. You assume that the past holds all the answers. You assume that the present, and you yourself, can only ever be a weaker version of what came before. You become afraid of repeating past mistakes, so you stop acting boldly. You become afraid of seeming naive, so you stop following your impulses. And you become afraid of judgment, so you silence your own instincts. And Nietzsche says that this fear destroys the very thing that makes a powerful, deep life possible, which is the ability to act from one's instincts. He says, history breaks up and dissolves the instincts of the strong nature. A quote-unquote strong nature for Nietzsche is someone who acts, who creates, who lives with courage, who doesn't need permission or precedent. But when the person becomes overloaded with history, their strength ends up dissolving. They can only imitate, never initiate. They can only comment, never create. Which is what leads us into part 3, which is why history kills creativity and creates more commentators than thinkers. This brings Nietzsche to his final warning, the one that hits hardest for artists, thinkers, writers, builders, and anyone trying to cultivate a deep life of creativity. Because he says, forgetting is essential to action of any kind. There could be no happiness, no cheerfulness, no hope, no pride, no present, without forgetfulness. This is one of Nietzsche's most counterintuitive ideas, that forgetting isn't a weakness, but rather a strength. Because if you never forgot what others have done, you'll never feel free to do something new, Nietzsche would say. If you're always thinking about the past philosophers, you'll never develop your own philosophies. If you're always thinking about past art, you'll never make art that truly feels alive in the current moment. If you're always comparing yourself to the greatest moments of history, you'll feel way too small to move yourself. And Nietzsche thinks that this is what's slowly been happening in society over time, where creativity is disappearing because people were becoming too informed. Instead of being inspired, they became intimidated. Instead of pursuing new ideas, they'd rather analyze old ones. Instead of becoming thinkers, they'd much rather be a commentator and talk about thinkers. And it's not that commentary is evil, it's that commentary becomes a substitute for creation. He was seeing that there was a lot more people going to university to study art, but then they just became art critics. Or there was a lot of people going to university to study philosophy, but then they end up spending their entire life talking about other people's philosophy without actually creating their own. And this was Nietzsche's critique in his time. I wonder what he would have to say about our time and about me as well. But he expresses this idea further when he writes this: the great moments of the past become a graveyard of the present. And what he's saying there is that when you admire the past too much, you just stop acting in the present. That you start feeling that everything important has already been done. That the quote-unquote golden age is always behind you and never in front of you. It's not something that you can cultivate. It's not something that you can live in right now. It's something you can only analyze and talk about when it happened hundreds of years ago. And so Nietzsche says that instead of building a golden age, you'd much rather spend your life trying to preserve one, curating it, analyzing it, celebrating it, repeating it, but never actually adding to it. And Nietzsche believed that this creates a culture of archivists, not innovators, collectors, not creators, once again, commentators, not thinkers. And the more we admire the past, the harder Nietzsche would say it becomes to act. Because action feels risky, action feels arrogant, action feels like stepping into a space where giants once walked, and most of us would rather watch from the sidelines than actually compete and walk among them. And yet, despite all of this, Nietzsche does end on a surprisingly hopeful note. Yes, he warns us that history can weaken us, divide us, paralyze us, and suffocate our creativity, but he also believes that we have the ability to break free from this. He believes that we can create better work, we can live deeper lives, build richer cultures, act boldly once again, but only if we loosen our grip on history. Only if we stop worshipping the past, but merely just pull from it where we feel necessary. Only if we stop trying to fix the past or relive it, but actually come up with ideas that we think can work better in the future, rather than just trying to fix an idea that was created hundreds, if not thousands of years ago. Because for Nietzsche, depth doesn't come from looking backwards, it comes from living forwards. Not from preserving life, but from actually participating in it. not from comparing ourselves to the dead, but from becoming fully alive ourselves. That, for Nietzsche, is the path to a deeper life. But what are your thoughts on that? Where do you agree with Nietzsche? Where do you disagree? Let me know down below in the comments. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you guys enjoyed that breakdown. I do want to say once again that I'm not agreeing or critiquing his idea. I'm merely just sharing it because I do think it's a very interesting one, and I think he raises some very interesting points that deserve to be thought about and talked about today. But I do implore you all to go out and read Untimely Meditations yourself, because this is just a short video. I can't capture all the information, I can't capture everything here, so please go out and read it, and I'm sure you'll find things that resonate yourself that perhaps I couldn't find. But with that said, I hope you guys liked the video. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and until next time, take care.